Gözünüzü de kapatın.
Tamam.
Good afternoon. Our guest speaker is Professor Meliha Altunışık from the Department of International Relations. Professor Altunışık is also the head of Graduate School of Social Sciences in METU. She was a Fulbright scholar at Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Harvard University in 1988 and 1989, and received her PhD in political science from Boston University in 1994. Professor Altunışık was a resident Fulbright scholar in the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. from January to June 2003. Her research interests include Middle East politics, Turkey's foreign policy towards the Middle East, IR theory, and international relations of the Middle East. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. Coming here today, I was thinking that I've been doing this for some time now. We started with Canan Hocam many years ago, and I always enjoyed being here and to talk to an audience that is not get their education in social sciences or international relations. Each year I try to, because my topic is Middle East politics, and as you know, things change quite rapidly in the Middle East. So each year I focus on different aspects of what is going on in the Middle East, and this year I decided to focus on this Iranian nuclear crisis and the deal that has been reached recently, because it has been on the news, as you know, I'm sure you followed, and it was touted as a big breakthrough in this nuclear crisis. So I wanted to share with you some aspects of this crisis and what are we in what stage we are now in this crisis. Okay, first, what is this crisis? Let's define that. The crisis erupted in 2002 when a group, an opposition group in Iran, Mujahideen Halk, leaked to the international press that Iran is secretly involved in producing nuclear weapons, or enriching uranium actually, and plutonium production facilities were in the process of being built in Iran. That was the leakage to the international community, if you will. And that created a crisis. Why? Well, because the international community and the institutions of the international community was not aware of this process in Iran, that this was a clandestine process of uranium enrichment and plutonium production, building of plutonium production facilities. When we look at the background of Iranian nuclear program, actually it goes back to the time of the Shah. And at that time, the Shah was trying to build a nuclear program with the help of Western countries. But then, when there was the revolution in Iran in 1979, the nuclear program was halted. They stopped the nuclear program in 1979. But this leakage made the claim that this program was later revived under the revolutionary regime in the late 1980s. Of course, late 1980s correspond to the end of Iran-Iraq War. Iran-Iraq War was one of the longest wars of the 20th century. It started in 1980 and lasted in 1988, and it was a very destructive war. And it seems that, I mean, at least that was the claim, Iran restarted its nuclear program towards the end of this war because they thought that this could be a deterrent against Iraq as well, because especially we today know more about this, that Iraq used chemical weapons against Iran during and also against its own people, Kurds in Iraq, during this war. Why this is a problem? Well, in order to understand that, we need to understand the international regime about nuclear programs. And this regime is called Nuclear Non-Proliferation Regime, NPT. Maybe you heard about it. And this is a treaty, an international treaty, which was signed in 1968, and it entered into force in 1970. What is the difference between the two? States can sign a treaty, but generally they require parliamentary approval or congressional approval of those international treaties. Only then these treaties can come into force. And in this case, NPT came into force in 1970. As you can see, this happened during the Cold War years, because an important element of the Cold War was that there were nuclear weapons involved. There were two blocs, and they were ideologically also confronting against each other. But a very important aspect of the Cold War was that there were nuclear powers with nuclear weapons. And this was creating an enormous concern, because such a war, a nuclear war, would have been totally destructive. And so therefore, it is understandable that this treaty was signed during the Cold War years. It has three pillars. One is that it aims to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and weapons technology. So, as the name indicates, it wants to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons, right? And the second is that it wants to allow, the second pillar is that, however, it wants to allow cooperation for peaceful uses of nuclear technology, because nuclear technology is not just used to produce weapons, but as you know, it is used for peaceful purposes. So the treaty, the second pillar of the treaty, allows for peaceful nuclear technology. And finally, the third pillar is the aim of disarmament, because it accepts that there is already nuclear powers. The ultimate aim of the treaty was disarmament as regards to nuclear weapons. Okay, the treaty recognized 5 states as nuclear weapons states. Okay, so this was accepted in the treaty. Sometimes this is called the club. You know, the club that already had nuclear technology and nuclear weapons, and these are the United States, at that time USSR, but now Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China. If you notice, these are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So these 5 permanent members acquired this license to have nuclear weapons, okay? So it is legitimate for them to have it. And then, since the signing of this treaty, we know that in the world there are other states, and there are only 4 that have nuclear weapons. And these are India, Pakistan, of course, these 2 rivals, you know, they have nuclear weapons. And there is North Korea. These 3 states, we know that they have it because they declared it. They detonated nuclear weapons, and you know, there's no ambiguity about them. And there is fourth, that is Israel. Israel neither says I have nuclear weapons, nor says I don't have nuclear weapons. I mean, we call this policy of ambiguity, okay? Although there is, you know, it is the well-known secret that they do have it, but they don't openly claim it. And they have not demonstrated so far that they have it. So these 4 states have nuclear weapons, but they are not part of the legitimate bloc within the NPT regime, right? And because they are not members of the NPT. North Korea actually was a member of the NPT, but really not actively participating and allowing inspection within the NPT, and eventually it withdrew from the NPT anyway. So these states are not part of the NPT. I mean, you may say that why non-nuclear states accepted this deal, to begin with, to give this 5 a special status. It was a deal in the sense that the rest of the countries accepted the special position of these 5 countries in return for promises of transfer of nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. Okay, so it was give and take. I have to say that before passing, NPT regime is generally in international relations is seen as one of the most successful regimes in terms of the treaty, the participation. I mean, there are 191 countries, almost the whole world, part of this treaty. So it is, in that sense, successful. I have to also mention the additional protocol because you probably hear about this as well. This was adopted in 1993, which is after the end of the Cold War. And the additional protocol brings a very important element to the NPT regime, and that is monitoring and safeguarding. And this is being done by an international organization. It is the watchdog of NPT treaty, and that is International Atomic Energy Agency. Okay? So when we talk about NPT, we also talk about additional protocol. Most of the states that signed NPT also signed the additional protocol. What about Iran? Well, Iran is a member of the NPT. It signed the NPT from the beginning, and it also signed the additional protocol after 1993, that is during the revolutionary regime. But however, this disclosure that Iran has this nuclear program, which was not announced, internationally, and which the IAEA was not aware of. So therefore, there was no monitoring or safeguarding mechanisms, and that Iran had been doing this for 18 years. Created a crisis. And when you look at the parties to this crisis, you have Iran on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have P5+1. I will explain what it is. Well, it is permanent members of the UN Security Council, 5 members, plus 1 is Germany. Why Germany? Because Germany has very much involved in trade relations with Iran, and in fact many German companies are very much involved in technology that is related to nuclear facilities as well. So Germany has been part of this from the beginning. And then we have regional countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Cooperation Council countries that are very much concerned about a possible nuclear Iran. You have Israel, which is in hostile relations with Iran and very much concerned about a possible nuclear Iran. And Turkey, of course, was monitoring these developments. So you have all these actors involved in this crisis situation. Okay, so P5+1, there's another name for this. I'm just mentioning, you may see that as well. EU3+3. It's another way of saying P5+1. And here, EU3 is UK, France, and Germany. +3 is the US, Russia, and China. Of course, you probably guessed it is the EU that refers to this group as EU3+3 rather than P5+1. So you may see both of those in writings about this. Particularly, starting from 2006, these countries began to put a lot of pressure for Iran to basically, cooperate and with the international community about this program. Okay, what basically motivates these countries? Well, it is clear that for the U.S., the fact that U.S. relations with Iran has been quite problematic since the revolution in Iran is an important factor here. Because you may say that there are other countries that have nuclear weapons and not even in the process of producing nuclear weapons, but already have nuclear weapons, such as India or Israel. Obviously, the US is not bothered so much that these two countries have it. So you have to really put it in the political context, international political context, to understand the reaction to this nuclear program. And here, since the revolution in Iran in 1979, the US-Iranian relations have been quite problematic. There is no diplomatic representation even of countries in each other's territories. There are US sanctions, freezing of Iranian assets in the US by the US administrations. So the relations are quite problematic. So US sees Iran as a problematic country in terms of its own interests in the Middle East. This clearly affects the context of this crisis. Related to that is the Israeli concerns about Iranian nuclear program, because Israel is in hostile relations with Iran, so therefore Israel feels threatened by an Iranian nuclear program. So clearly there are political motivations, and linked to that there is this general issue of mistrust, and this has exacerbated by the fact that Iran did not report its uranium enrichment program for 18 years. This further exacerbated the mistrust towards Iran, okay? Because it was clearly in breach of its NPT obligations. According to the NPT, if you are launching a nuclear program, you need to report it to the NPT and to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Another concern for P5+1 is the possible nuclear arms race in the Middle East, because it is clear that, and many states declare this, if Iran went nuclear, several other states would think going nuclear. Mainly Saudi Arabia, Egypt, they already declared, during this crisis, that if Iran goes nuclear, we will go nuclear as well. Why this is a problem? Of course, there are some scholars who argue that states having nuclear weapons is not necessarily a bad idea, because there is what we call deterrence. And for that, their model is the Cold War. They say, look, US and USSR had plenty of nuclear weapons, but that prevented a war between them, right? Instead, during the Cold War years, these two countries involved in what we call proxy wars. They did not fight with each other directly because it deterred them from fighting with each other. They knew the consequences of a war. So they argue that countries in the Middle East having nuclear weapons is not necessarily a bad thing, that deterrence can work. But there is another argument which says that deterrence is very fragile. Maybe it worked between the two superpowers. This does not mean that it will necessarily work in a regional scale. And in any case, the consequences of a nuclear war in a regional scale is also catastrophic. So therefore, these concerns were also voiced. What did Iran say in response to these claims? Well, first of all, it said that from the beginning, I'm not doing nuclear bomb, I'm just having a nuclear program. I'm not having a nuclear weapon. It's not a weaponization program, but it is just a nuclear program for peaceful purposes. And argued that this is not a breach of NPT because I have a right, according to the NPT, as I already mentioned, to have a peaceful nuclear industry under the NPT, and that's what I'm doing. Of course, the cynics never believed in that. There were several arguments. Some people said, well, Iran is an oil-rich, natural gas-rich country. Why would Iran need nuclear energy? Right? This was one of the arguments. I mean, the issue of mistrust was there, as I already mentioned. This map shows the research reactors and nuclear sites in Iran. As you see, there are several, and none of this were known to the international community up until the 2000s, and clearly they were built before. Okay, so the result was a stalemate. Okay, the two sides had their own positions. Iran eventually, because of the pressures, agreed to inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The agency could not confirm that Iran was really building nuclear weapons, but of course there is, this is an issue of international politics, but it's also an issue of, engineering and science as well, because this uranium enrichment, with uranium enrichment, you can easily pass the threshold. I mean, you can enrich the uranium to a certain level for peaceful purposes, but you can increase the enrichment and easily turn this into a weapon. So it's not easy to really determine that threshold. Okay, and today there are countries, for instance, and eventually this is how Iran is going to be treated. For instance, Japan. Japan has the nuclear technology. It has the nuclear weapon technology. It can enrich the uranium to produce a weapon, but it does not. Because of international agreements after World War II, it is not allowed, like Germany, to produce nuclear weapons. But this does not mean that it doesn't have the technology. If it decides to do so, it can do it. Okay? So what will happen to Iran today will be the same thing, it looks like. So, okay, but the pressures on Iran continued. There were several efforts to negotiate. The US, especially under President Bush, W. Bush, didn't want direct negotiations with Iran, because it adopted a very tough position towards Iran. But instead of the US, the EU countries, these three EU countries, began to negotiate with Iran. There were several rounds of negotiations, but nothing really was produced. There were mediation efforts. You may remember Turkey and Brazil. These were two temporary members of the UN Security Council at that time. They came up with a proposal and Iran accepted it. There was an agreement, but the US refused to accept this, and on the contrary, in the UN Security Council, they imposed further sanctions on Iran, where Turkey voted no, and Brazil as well. They didn't support these sanctions. But there were several efforts to resolve this conflict, initially without direct US participation, and since the beginning of this crisis there have been 6 UN Security Council resolutions. These resolutions are either calling on Iran to halt nuclear program or imposing new rounds of sanctions on Iran. Okay? So sanctions became a very important tool that international community, and particularly P5+1, used against Iran. And at the same time, the US continued, especially under the Bush, continued to talk about what they called military option, to eradicate nuclear program by attacking Iran. And this was done in the past. For instance, in the 1980s, Israel attacked Iraq's nuclear reactor in Osirak and destroyed the reactor, halted the nuclear program in Iraq. So the same option was debated for Iran, but at the same time, the difficulties of a military option became clear, because as you can see, the nuclear facilities are widespread around the country, and some of them are highly protected, and it was decided that it would be very difficult to do so, but particularly Israel kept bringing this to the fore when Iranian nuclear program was concerned. In 2012, US and EU started to impose new rounds of sanctions. You know this affected Turkey as well. I mean, this is one of the reasons why Turkey buys oil and gas from Iran, but cannot directly pay to Iran, and the money is deposited in Halkbank. Now we know, and part of it was turned into gold, and brought to Iran by Reza Sarraf. Now we know more about this, but Turkey tried to get around this sanctions. Because these rounds of sanctions were stricter, anybody doing business with Iran was punished. Okay, so the aim was to put pressure on Iran to negotiate with the P5+5. The last final round of negotiations, we are still in this process, started in 2013, and we started to see some important changes in the negotiations. I mean, as early as 2013, an interim agreement was signed between P5+1 and Iran in Geneva, and this called for a 6-month freeze and partial rollback in Iran's nuclear program, which was the first time that Iran accepted such a limitation. But this was going to be in exchange for decreasing economic sanctions on Iran. So there was a limited interim agreement. In 2014, negotiations continued. The two sides argued that there is a significant progress in the negotiations, but we need more time. And finally, in 2015, they already had this March 21st deadline in Geneva to reach a framework agreement. They couldn't do it, but then US Secretary of State said that I'm not going back to Washington, we'll continue to negotiate. And finally, on April the 2nd, we all heard that a framework agreement was signed. And this was touted as a very important milestone. Before talking about what is to be expected, let's try to understand what happened. I mean, why, and starting from 2013, you had this rapid progress, and they reached to this, to this level in 2015. Well, there have been some changes. I mean, on the Iranian side, one important change has been domestic political change. Previously, as you know, Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran, quite tough and critical of especially the international community and the United States. Coming of power of Rouhani, who represents the reformist camp, had an impact. Although I have to say that in Iran, nuclear issue is a bit complicated. I mean, it does not really follow the conservative reformist divide always, because some conservatives are totally against nuclear weapons. They think that it's against religion, and some reformists are for nuclear weapons. So it is a very complicated issue, and for Iran, this nuclear technology is also a sense of pride, that they are doing this and they can do this is a sense of prestige and pride. So there are several factors affecting this nuclear program. But for Rouhani, coming of Rouhani is important because this group want to really facilitate Iran's return to international community, peaceful return to international community. This is a country that have been under sanctions and isolation for a long time. They want to end this. They want to end this for different reasons, but also they want to end this for their domestic survival, because when Iran is cornered, when Iran is close to the international community, the more radicals and conservatives gain ground. So they think that for reformers to succeed, they also need this return to international community. So since they came to power in 2003, this is the most important file that they focused on. I mean, they all, for them, everything hinged on this, these negotiations. So they really put a lot of emphasis on it. So this is important. But another important factor is that in the last few years, it became clear that sanctions are really hurting Iran. I was in Iran in December. I mean, you can easily see this. It really affects, Iranian people, and add to this declining oil prices, right, in the last few years. So sanctions have been hurting Iran, and they wanted to get rid of these sanctions, okay? So these two factors came together and really made a change in Iran's attitude. For P5+1, I think Obama administration made a difference because George W. Bush administration was tougher on Iran and closer to Israel on this issue, whereas Obama administration from the beginning made it clear that it is more eager to negotiate. They wanted negotiated solution to this conflict rather than, imposing more sanctions or even use of military force. And they also came to a point of accepting, in a way, Iranian existing capacity, and they started to focus on what is called breakout time. Breakout time is the time this country needs, or any country with nuclear technology needs, to turn it into a nuclear weapon. And for them, 1 year, right, it would take Iran at least a year to make enough fissile material for a nuclear warhead, if it chooses to do so. So that break of time became acceptable to the United States, okay? Instead of insisting that everything had to be demolished, right? That's the position of Israel, for instance. But the US shifted its position. And the result is this historic deal, the so-called historic deal. Of course, we have to realize that this is still a framework agreement. It's not the agreement itself. It is very important, but it has to, we have to wait till June, that is the deadline, for a final agreement. But is it going to be easy? No, because one of the problems is that there are several obstacles, but the most important problem is domestic politics in both Iran and particularly in the United States. Because in the United States, Congress is really for more tougher positions on Iran. Obama can only suspend sanctions, but he cannot really, completely erase them. That's the job of the Congress, and Congress, both Democrats and conservatives, are tougher on Iran than Obama. And they have already came together and argued that they need to see more progress for lifting of sanctions. And this is one of the obstacles. You may remember recently, despite the administration's and Obama's criticism, Netanyahu directly went to the US Congress and gave a big speech in the US Congress criticizing this deal. And he gave so much details that because of that, probably the US administration realized that Netanyahu must have some kind of spying, on these negotiations, and this created a crisis between Israel and the United States. So this domestic constraint in the United States is there. Already they are discussing, you know, whether the sanctions will be lifted in stages or as Iran wants, you know, lifted at once, this is a big issue. For Iran too, I mean, domestic politics is important because, as you probably saw on TV, Zarif, you know, the foreign minister who signed the framework agreement, went back to Iran. People were dancing on the streets, you know, and he had a hero's welcome, right? I'm sure conservatives didn't like that, you know, didn't like that. They're losing sort of ground to the reformers. So we had seen such things before, so I'm sure there would be some struggle within Iranian domestic politics as well, and that puts, you know, a question mark to a possible deal. Regional actors, I mean, I already mentioned Israel is not happy, but Saudi Arabia and other Gulf cooperation countries are not happy either. They think that this shifts the balance of power towards Iran, and they argue that, you know, they don't like this, and Obama, you know, called all of the leaders of these countries and explained the situation. Turkey's position is sort of more mixed because Turkey from the beginning supported a negotiated deal, never supported a military option on Iran. Of course, there will be things that Turkey will lose and there will be things that Turkey will gain, but Turkey has a more balanced position, whereas some other countries in the region are really very much scared that this will be at their expense. The big debate as regards to that, and I will end with that, is that if there's a deal, right? Of course, there is also we need to think scenarios about if there is no deal. But even if there is a deal, the issue is how this will affect Iran's role in the region. Because one of the concerns right now, and you are probably aware of it, is that Iran has increased its influence all over the region. I mean, it is very much powerful in Iraq now. It has been there since 2003, but with the ISIL threat, you know, it is fighting on the ground with the ISIL. It is physically there as well. In Syria, Iran has been the main actor in support of Bashar Assad, and Iranian Revolutionary Guard and Hezbollah also fighting in Iran, in Syria. In Lebanon, Iran's influence is quite high because of Hezbollah and its place in Lebanese politics. And now in Yemen, with Houthis coming to power, toppling the regime, Iranian influence is increasing. So there is this concern that with a deal, Iran and lifting of sanctions, etc., Iran will be very influential, more influential, even more influential in the region. This is the concern of many regional countries. I mean, they are saying that if Iran is already very influential with this level of oil prices, with all these sanctions, now it will have plenty of money to spend on, you know, all these groups and in all these countries. I mean, this is one scenario. Of course, the other scenario is that Iran may behave more responsibly and constructively as a result of a deal, because one of the things that was making Iran more aggressive was that it was cornered, you know, it felt threatened by the United States, by the regional powers, etc. It could turn into a more constructive actor. There are scenarios about Turkey and Iran, for instance, working for a more, transition in Syria, for instance. There is that kind of argument as well. And also the US seems to give the message that, you know, there could be a deal on the nuclear issue, but it does not mean that I would give carte blanche to Iran in in regional politics. I mean, the example for this is U.S. criticism of Iran in Yemen. Openly, Obama administration criticized Iran in Yemen. So it seems that, while as maybe usual, the region is on the verge of yet another, important transformation. And there, I think this Iranian deal and how and when Iran will return to the international community and to the region as a normal actor will have enormous repercussions. And I think this will be the variable that will affect many conflicts also in the region as well. And let me stop here, and I would be happy if you have questions. I would be happy to answer them. Thank you. Yes?
As far as I know, this deal is only about the nuclear, is it also including the major resources of the Iraq?
You mean natural gas? And,
Yes.
No. This is actually, that was the initial position. I think the parties decided that the negotiations will focus exclusively on the nuclear file. They didn't include anything else. They didn't even include regional issues like Syria, for instance. I mean, that was on purpose. They didn't want these other issues to contaminate the nuclear file. But as I try to explain, even if this is the case, if there is a deal, this will inevitably have repercussions for other issues. For instance, for other resources, what will be the repercussions if the sanctions are lifted? I mean, as you know, Iran is one of the top 3 natural gas producers with Russia and Qatar. Iran is one of the top 3 oil producers in the world. It is a very important country for these resources. So, and Iran has been under sanctions for a long time. They have been using, more backward technology to produce oil and natural gas. With the opening of Iran, this will create enormous opportunities for international companies to come to Iran, and it will have repercussions for that. I mean, it's inevitable. It's inevitable.
Taking into consideration the historical crisis in the Middle East and the constant conflict between Iran and Arab Gulf countries and Israel, of course, do you see it possible that Iran, when they can become a normal, as you mentioned, member and actor of international community?
Well, I mean, you are right. There are self-entrenched, issues of mistrust, and there's a historical baggage, etc. But there are, when you look at it, even after the revolution, which created, more tense relations with Israel and with the Gulf countries, there were times where relations were more normal than it is today with the Gulf countries. I mean, I would say that after the Gulf War, for instance, in 1991, there was normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And Iran, the President Rafsanjani especially, was paying more attention to normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia was seeing Iraq as a threat, with the invasion of Kuwait, was open to this normalization. At that time, it didn't really proceed because of the US position against Iran and dual containment policy. With Israel, of course, it depends on how this deal will affect domestic Iranian politics. I mean, this is going to be, I mentioned the regional dimension, but domestic dimension for Iran would be as equally important. If, for instance, the reformers gain ground, and this will have repercussions, because when you go back to the first reformist government, you know, Hatami, you may remember the debates at that time, because the reformers were saying that, you know, why are we so adamant about the Palestinian issue? I mean, why are we more Palestinian or more Arab than Arabs, right? They were saying that openly. I mean, they were criticizing this over-engagement of Iran with the Palestinian issue. You know, I mean, we cannot say this will never change. There could be some possibilities. I agree it is difficult. When I say return as a normal actor, I don't necessarily mean very amicable relations, you know, between countries. It's just usual kind of engagement with each other. And that could be a possibility.
So you think that the reformist, the reformist party will change its strategy in Syria, Iraq?
We'll see. It's a question mark, as I said. I mean, there are two perspectives on it. Some say that it is the different face of the same coin. You know, it's good cop, bad cop. You know, this is one argument. If that is the case, of course, we will not see much change. Others say that the Rouhani camp did not really challenge the Syria policy so far because they wanted to consolidate themselves, and for that they needed the nuclear deal, so they focused their attention on the nuclear deal. If that is the case, and if as a result of the nuclear deal they may consolidate themselves more, you know, they may shift. I don't mean to say that they would completely leave Syria, but at least try to find a more acceptable negotiated solution, because ultimately Iran is losing there as well. I mean, Syria is you know, in shambles. I don't see any winner in that, and it's breeding radicalism, which is also affecting Iran. So that's what I meant. But we will see. I mean, eventually it may not, the nuclear deal may not totally reconfigure the domestic balances as well, because I mean, conservative groups like, and also revolutionary guards, etc., they're very much entrenched. They control the economy also through bonyads and all that. So therefore, it's not an easy thing. I mean, I see that. I'm just exploring the possibilities. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, good luck with your studies.